By now you've probably seen Apple Music's top 100 albums of all time. You've let it marinate, you've formed an opinion, and probably have been enraged by some of their picks. But hey, no such list will ever be perfect. And to be fair, I learned that they did try to involve a younger demographic when voting, hence why you'll see a lot more modern albums featured in the list. Even though I personally fall into this demographic, I think it's a bit much. They did have a heavy bias towards hip hop, R&B, a bias towards newer albums. A list such as an all-time list definitely needs to incorporate music all the way back to, I would say, the 60s, 50s, maybe even 40s, but we didn't see enough represented in this list, unfortunately. There are a lot of albums that haven't even been out for 5 years. It's a bit too early to really see their true impact unfold. So my objective for this video is to react to the list, give you a review on some of the albums that I personally own. If I'm missing any albums, let me know in the comments so I can continue to expand my music taste. And before I start, I have to say I do have a bias towards hip hop and R&B just because I grew up listening to that music. However, in the past years, I've definitely tried to expand my taste, get into the world of rock, jazz, funk, and the subgenres that belong to those genres. Try to expand my music taste through record collecting, letting Spotify do its thing, and taking personal recommendations from you guys. So with that, let's get started. Starting with number 99, Hotel California. Now, I definitely heard about this album from the lead single. However, I've come to learn that it was nominated for a Grammy for Album of the Year it came out. It has sold to date 32 million copies, which is crazy. The quality of the tracks from front to back were great in my opinion, and so I definitely think it deserves to be here. Next up is Rage Against the Machine by Rage Against the Machine. This one I have on CD, and I remember this was the album that helped me transition from a hip-hop head to more of a rock fan, let's say. It definitely blurred the lines between metal and rap, and this is why I think this album deserves to be here. It not only is a great album musically, but also had such a strong political message, and I think they conveyed it pretty well, so definitely deserves to be on this list. Next up, I have Nina Simone's I Put a Spell on You at number 88. This is definitely a timeless classic. She has one of the most iconic voices in soul music today, so I definitely believe she deserves a spot on this list. To this day, I Put a Spell on You and Feeling Good are just simply timeless. It's been covered many times. She also did these covers, but I believe her versions have kind of stood the test of time in comparison to others. At number 72, we have SZA's SOS. This one I find interesting because I love this album. It is currently still on the Billboard 200, so it's doing really, really well right now. However, it only came out a couple years ago, and some would argue Control is even a better album than this one, but I love it. I wouldn't say it deserves to be in the top 100, but definitely a must listen if you are into R&B. Moving a few positions down, at number 55, we have Rihanna's Anti or Anti. I personally love this album. This is definitely Rihanna's best album, front to back. It is more bold. It plays with a few other genres compared to other pop albums. If you're gonna take one album from Rihanna, this would be it. However, if I look at the whole list, I don't know if I could squeeze her in the top 100, but if we're considering a younger demographic, I would definitely put this in the top 100. Next up at number 50, we have Kate Bush's Hounds of Love. I do have to admit, I only discovered Kate Bush because of Stranger Things. The fact that she was able to produce a song such as Running Up the Hill in a modern series and really make an impact, I think that speaks volumes. I remember listening to this album for the first time and was blown away by the sounds. I never heard instrumentation like it, and so if you're into that, experimental rock, spacey, electronic kind of vibe, definitely listen to Kate Bush and her other works as well. I think this is a great entry into her music. Next up, moving down to 31, Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill. I have to also admit, I didn't really listen to this album very much. However, I do know she's Canadian. She has a few iconic tracks here, and when I listen to this album, I feel the teen angst. I do recognize the influence she's had on artists such as Avril Lavigne, also another Canadian. The way she delivers is super iconic. I don't know if it deserves to be number 31 of all time, but I would say probably towards the end half of the top 100, but I think she deserves a spot personally. Dark Side of the Moon at number 28, I think is a bit too low. In fact, you can argue that this is Pink Floyd's best album of all time. Some would say Wish You Were Here, The Wall, or Animals, but I would say this one is definitely the greatest. It has had the biggest impact. The cover is iconic. A lot of people attribute this album to the quintessential album of prog rock, and it has stood the test of time, simply. It's also one of the best-selling albums of all time, so the fact that it can reach so many people and really transcend generations, I think speaks volumes. So this definitely deserves to be there. I would personally probably put it in the top 10 just in terms of its greatness overall. And just a couple spots down is Kanye West's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. This one I feel like has sparked a lot of debate in the hip-hop community, not only for his personal antics, but also just how debatable his discography is. And this is my personal favorite from Kanye. Some would say College Dropout, some would say Yeezus, some would say Graduation, but I feel like this one was bold, experimental, luscious, grandiose. I would say if it weren't for his antics, I would say it would probably belong in the top 20. I think it would be the top 20 in my list, so definitely deserves a spot on the top 100. Just below that is Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. Now, when I was just getting into jazz, this was often the recommended album you should listen to first. I've come to learn that this album is iconic for many reasons. Miles Davis essentially assembled the Avengers of the 50s and 60s jazz era, including the likes of John Coltrane, Paul Chambers. I learned it is also recorded in only 2 sessions, so to have such quality in such a short time is super noteworthy. And front to back, I believe this album truly highlighted everyone's strengths. Definitely check out some of Davis's other works. I would recommend Bitches Brew as well. I would say that would also deserve a spot in the top 100, but Kind of Blue is definitely the safest pick. And just below that is David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust. This was also the first album I listened to when I was getting introduced to Bowie's music. I've always knew he was iconic, but when I listened to this album, I've come to learn that he was quite ahead of his time. His persona, his identity changed throughout his career, and it was at this point where he really owned his alienated identity, if I can say that, by embodying the persona of Ziggy Stardust. I love the spacey concept on this album. This is definitely a classic glam rock album and definitely deserving a spot on this top 100 list. At number 21, we have the Beatles' Revolver. Not my personal favorite Beatles album, but I think they can probably squeeze 3 or 4 albums in the top 100 if you're asking me. This album features one of my favorite songs from the Beatles, Eleanor Rigby, and I would also say this is one of their most experimental albums, taking influences from all over the world. There's a few tracks with sitars which I find really well done, and you can also see a bit of that influence on Sgt. Pepper, but this is definitely a Beatles classic and deserving of a spot in the top 100, probably towards the latter half of 100, but definitely deserving of a spot here. Now we enter the top 20, and at number 17 we have Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. In my opinion, this has got to be one of the closest albums to reach perfection. This album definitely needs to be listened to in order, front to back. It was written at a time around the Vietnam War, where it's from a perspective of a veteran coming back from the war and just seeing that there's still injustice, there's still poverty, still a drug problem, and he hones in on his experiences. His soulful delivery is impactful, and during the recording of this album I learned he was also kind of in a depressive state, and you can really feel that in his performance. He even mentions his gospel and religious influence on God Is Love. Honestly, front to back, one of my favorite albums of all time. Depending on my mood, I would place it at the top, so I would say 17 is rather low, but definitely deserving to be on this list. Then at number 13 we have Jay-Z's Blueprint. Now, Jay-Z is my personal favorite hip-hop artist of all time, but Blueprint isn't even my favorite album by his. However, I have to say this is probably peak Jay-Z when it came to popularity, topping the charts, has a pretty consistent concept throughout this album. Do I think this deserves to be on the top 100? Sure, you can make a case, but 13 is definitely a bit too high. There are surely plenty of hip-hop albums that deserve to be placed higher than the Blueprint, but if you're going to take one Jay-Z album, this is probably it. I personally like Reasonable Doubt and the Black Album, but Blueprint is a pretty safe choice, I would say. Just below that, at number 12 is Radiohead's OK Computer. Now, looking at some discussions, threads, forums, a lot of people say Kid A could be here instead of OK Computer. It is also mentioned in this list, and I would personally say OK Computer is better than Kid A. It's dark, it's emotional. For me, it has a lot less skips than Kid A, so if you're gonna take a Radiohead album, I would personally put this higher, but I'm happy to see that they have 2 on this list. Below that, at number 11, we have Fleetwood Mac's Rumours. Now, what seems like a greatest hits album, everything came together on this record. It's truly a generational album, appealing to all kinds of audiences. It might be due to the fact that the viral Ocean Spray video gave it a little bit of a boost, but in any case, it continues to be one of the best-selling vinyl records of all time. The cover is iconic, and front to back, there's just bangers upon bangers. So definitely add this to your collection if you haven't already. Definitely deserving to be on this list. And now we get to the top 10, and we have Beyonce's Lemonade. In my opinion, quite controversial. This is my personal favorite Beyonce album. It's daring, it's genre fluid. She has a little bit of a rock, country influence on top of her already strong R&B and hip hop presence. She's able to tell stories of infidelity, female empowerment in such a powerful way. But is it a top 10 album of all time? Personally, no. I would probably compare it with an Anti from Rihanna. I would say this is probably better, but deserving to be in the top 100, probably in the latter half, I would say. But I think it's a little bit too high to be at the top 10 of all albums ever released. At number 7, we have Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, M.A.A.d City. This one caused a lot of controversy. I was watching a few YouTube videos on the list. A lot of people would have placed Pimp A Butterfly there, but you can make a good case for Good Kid, M.A.A.d City. It's still on the Billboard 200. It is truly timeless. It is a masterpiece of a hip-hop album when it comes to storytelling. You have the hits, but you also have high-quality vocal performances from Kendrick Lamar. You can argue it's one of the best albums of all time. Depending on my mood, I would go between T-Pab and Good Kid, M.A.A.d City, but not super mad at its inclusion. Could be a little too high when it comes to the overall list, but definitely deserving of a spot, at least in the top 50, I would say. Just below that, at number 6, we have Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life. It's really rare that such a packed album has no skips. I would say this album has no skips. This is peak Stevie Wonder, one of the most iconic soul artists of all time. His voice, his music is timeless. He has influenced so many people. I've heard his music sampled in so many hip-hop songs. And this is truly the embodiment of Motown Soul. I would say this is a candidate for best album of all time. I would place it in the top 5, but not happy with its placement here. Then at number 5, we have Frank Ocean's Blonde. Without going into too much detail, do I think this deserves to be top 5 album of all time? No. But if you ask, let's say, the Gen Z millennial demographic, what is their favorite album of all time? It would probably be Blonde, and they probably could make a good case around it. But, you know, if we look back a century and we look at the different genres of music, their influence and impact, I don't know if this album has still marinated enough. It's been around for some years now, but I wouldn't say it has transcended generations. I would give it some time, but if you're gonna take an iconic R&B album, I think Blonde definitely deserves to be there. Top 5 of all time in all genres? Probably not. And then we have Prince's Purple Rain. This album absolutely deserves to be here. This is by far his most successful and digestible album in my opinion. Even though this is a soundtrack, Prince does not sacrifice quality here at all. He proved he was talented before this album, but this is definitely his magnum opus and continues to touch hearts to this day. At number 3, we have the Beatles' Abbey Road. I 1000% agree with this placement. I personally put it in my top 3, top 5. No need to explain why it's iconic. From the track sequencing, how digestible it is of an album, the diversity of rock influences on this album are clear. You can argue that some of their other records are more experimental, but I would say this is probably the first album I would recommend an alien if they were to come to Earth for the first time and want to learn what kind of music humans can make. I personally don't believe in aliens, by the way, but if that were to be the case, Abbey Road would be the album I make them listen to. At number 2, we have Michael Jackson's Thriller. This album also doesn't need a lot of explanation. The hits on it are super iconic. There's a reason why it's the best-selling album of all time. It was revolutionary for its time. The music videos were just insane. Billie Jean is sung in karaoke rooms all over the world. Thriller just continues to be played every Halloween. I mean, what more can you say? The only flaw I would say about the album is that it does sound like a bunch of hits rather than a cohesive concept. But in any case, you can't have a list such as top 100 and not include the King of Pop. You could put Off the Wall here, you could put M.A.A.d here if you really wanted to, but in terms of greatness, you can't argue that Thriller doesn't deserve to be mentioned in the discussion. And finally, we have the #1 album according to Apple Music, Lauryn Hill's Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Her only solo album, but truly a masterpiece. Alright, let's try that again. My phone unfortunately ran out of space. I only have an iPhone 11 with 64 gigs of storage, so definitely not optimal for shooting long videos such as this one. But now that that's out of the way, I have to give this album its flowers. It's a fantastic hip-hop record. She sings her heart out. She can compete with the top hip-hop artists of our time. She can compete with the vocalists of our time. Front to back, it's a strong concept. It's influenced generations. It's played heavily to this day. It's sampled a ton. You could definitely make a case that it's the best album of all time. But if I look at the grand scheme of things, if I look at other genres in music, if I look back decades, I don't know if it has had a stronger impact compared to some albums on this list. But I would personally put it in my personal top 10 just because it blurs genres, it is transcendent of time, and it's simply a headbanger front to back. So yeah, shout out to Lauryn. Congrats on topping this list. Can't deny that this is a stellar album. Now that the list is out of the way, I'd love to share with you what I think are some snubs. I've seen a few videos online that share similar opinions to me, so I don't think I'm crazy when I mention these albums. But yeah, let's give it a go. Starting with, as I mentioned before, To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar. If I can make an argument for this album against Good Kid, M.A.A.d City, it is extremely dense, layered, fuses genres like jazz, soul, funk on top of the already amazing hip-hop performance, includes amazing collabs including Thundercat, George Clinton, Snoop Dogg, and even the well-edited conversation with Tupac at the end. I think it wraps up the album perfectly. But if you ask my personal opinion, I think this is a higher quality album. Not for most ears, but if you really take the time to listen to the lyrics, the storyline, on most days, I would personally put this album above Good Kid, M.A.A.d City. Continuing on with hip-hop, I definitely want to shout out Madvillainy by Madlib and MF Doom. In my opinion, this is the best collab between a producer and a hip-hop artist. As a hip-hop head, I'm pretty sure you're going to include this in your top 10 albums of all time. So in my opinion, on a list like this, I think it definitely deserves its flowers. What I think was rather underrepresented on Apple's top 100 list is the genre of funk. And if I were to include at least one funk album, it would definitely be this one by Funkadelic, Maggot Brain. I remember playing the first track on this one and I simply had an eargasm. The guitar solos are just nuts on this record and the funk goes hard. So if you're starting to get into funk or you're unfamiliar with this album, definitely give it a listen and hopefully you'll see why I'm making these comments. Moving on to R&B Soul, I was quite disappointed that I didn't see a single Weeknd album considering the younger demographic. I remember this album this album was snubbed from the Grammys. It didn't get a single nod despite having some of the biggest tracks not only of the year but of all time. Blinding Lights, Heartless, In Your Eyes, Save Your Tears, and then the list goes on and on. I think over time this will definitely get its credit, but I would say this is peak Weeknd. Dawn FM was pretty solid as well, and I'm looking for the third installment of this series that he has come up with. I know Love Deluxe was mentioned on this list, but my personal favorite from Sade is Diamond Life. I think this has a lot more timeless hits. Love Deluxe is a pretty solid album and I can't complain it being on the list, but if you want my personal opinion, I would put Diamond Life over that album. I was also surprised to not see a single Whitney Houston album. If you make a list of the top female vocalists of all time, Whitney Houston has got to be there. She's in my top 3, if not my favorite female vocalist. And I would say that her self-titled album is probably her best. I could also argue that the Bodyguard soundtrack could have been here as well, but in terms of her own solo efforts, I would say this one should be on the list, if any, Whitney Houston album. Moving on to rock, as I mentioned before, I would put Sgt. Pepper over Revolver. I think it's more experimental. They have some of the most iconic tracks on this album.
Across the Universe.
It's just a perfect closer. Probably top 5 best songs from the Beatles. So I would personally put this one on the top 100 list over Revolver. And another snub I think was quite surprising was not mentioning In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. A lot of rockheads would definitely put this among the top prog rock albums of all time. It's super influential. They had such a revolutionary sound at the time, and I discovered this band when I figured out that Kanye sampled the first track on his song Power, and once I gave the album a listen, I was a fan, so I definitely want to dig into their discography a bit more. If you like Pink Floyd and similar bands, definitely check out King Crimson. They are a must if you're into prog rock. In terms of folk, I was a bit surprised not to see any Simon and Garfunkel. I don't know too much of their songs, but this one has tons of highlights. I would put Bridge Over Troubled Water in the top 100. I don't know where exactly, but I definitely think it deserves to be recognized. It is timeless. It still slaps to this day, so I would definitely include this in the top 100. There are a few more I want to shout out, and I know that Apple is an American company. I know that the US music market is the biggest in the world, but if we're looking at all music around the world, I think there should have been more representation from international albums, and so I have 3 here that I would love to shout out, and in case you haven't heard of them, definitely check them out and dig into the discography of the artists I mentioned, starting with Getz Gilberto by Stan Getz and João Gilberto. This is actually a collab between an American and a Brazilian, and it was this album that is essentially the quintessential bossa nova album coming out of Brazil. I think the combination of jazz and the bossa nova style at the time was pivotal for this album, for this genre, and for these musicians to really take off. The vibes in this one are super smooth. There's a little bit of English in it, but it's mostly Portuguese. Even though I don't understand what they're saying, I think I can still feel what they intended the listener to feel. So definitely check this one out if you're into jazz, if you're into Latin music. Next one is by Serge Gainsbourg, coming from France. I discovered Gainsbourg when I was living in Paris last year. I asked my colleagues, who is the #1 artist I should start listening to that is iconic, that has a solid discography, and Serge Gainsbourg's name came up. When I was reading lists on his best albums, Histoire de Melody Nelson often came up at the top. This one's interesting. It took me a few listens to really get into, but Gainsbourg has such a suave voice. This is a narrative album. It tells a story about an older fellow and his romantic relationship with a younger woman. It's provocative, it's sexy, it's smooth, and the instrumentals here are crazy as well, so definitely check it out. Took me a few listens to get used to, but once I got into it, it was amazing. And finally, Buena Vista Social Club by Buena Vista Social Club. This is definitely a Latin record you need to listen to if you haven't already. It's pretty iconic, it's pretty popular. I'm surprised it wasn't mentioned on this list because it has stood the test of time. It was recorded in the 90s, but still plays heavily to this day. They didn't have a lot of releases. They split up quite early, if I'm not mistaken, and they went on to do a lot of solo efforts. It has been repressed many times. This one I got during Record Store Day this year and includes some tracks that were missing from the original version, but with any version, definitely give it a listen. The Latin flair is top notch on this one, and definitely must listen if you are into Latin music, rock, jazz, something in that area, because I do think it fuses those genres pretty well. So that about wraps it up for my take on Apple's list, including some of my snubs. Let me know what I got right, what I got wrong, what I should listen to next. If I was crazy at all during this video, let me know. But I'm mostly looking forward to your recommendations. I want to continue to expand my music and influence others to also discover new music. And if you like that video, please give this video a like, subscribe if you'd like, and hopefully I see you in the next one. Peace.